So I'll ask everyone to turn on their cameras now. Bev, do join us as well. Do turn on your camera as well. As I know you've got your own experiences around equality and inclusion. So let's just see. I'm gonna, before we go to the questions, do everybody put your questions into the Q&A box and we'll come to them, and raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question directly yourself and we can come to you. I think one question I wanted to ask from the start is, we're always suggesting to groups that, you know, if they want to know what people want, then they need to go and ask them and speak to groups directly and speak to people directly and find out what they need. Do you have any advice on how to do that without them putting the onus on that group or that individual to lead the way or to come up with the solutions and the answers? Because I think sometimes it can be a bit like you're just passing that on to someone else to do for you. Any thoughts on that? Bev, come on in.
Hello. I suppose I'm coming at this from a disability perspective. And I found that if anyone's ever approached me to ask for advice on, you know, involving disabled people in their engagement plans, or, you know, trying to get them to visit sites or to make things more accessible, it's just been a case of I've advised them literally just to go to a group and be really honest and just ask them what they think, what their thoughts are, what their lived experience has been, and just to be completely out there and not put any pressure on them, you know, to sort of take hold of it and run with it themselves. But it's just being honest. I suppose I've had experiences in the past where, well, one experience in particular where I visited a site up in North Yorkshire, and I've never been back there since because of this experience. And it was literally a paid entrance ticket. And I got to the front of the queue with my family, and I mean, I've got an artificial arm, and they had discounted tickets for disabled people, you know, no mention of you must be disabled in a certain way or anything like that, which would have been awful even if they had put that. But at the front of a very long queue, to then be asked to prove my disability in front of a lot of people was such a huge off-putting experience, and it stayed with me forever. And you could just tell that organisation hadn't been out to, you know, their users or their visitors and actually asked, you know, how they could tackle, you know, that sort of ticket pricing question. So yeah, I think it's just being honest, being open, and just being quite open that you're asking for their advice and you really want to take it on board. Sorry, that was a very rambling answer.
No, that was great. And it's having an element of sensitivity. Think about what you're asking people. You're not asking people to prove that they're a student. You know, it is different and it needs to be handled differently.
Yeah.
Lisa, I don't know whether you have any thoughts on that.
I think what I've noticed recently with heritage organisations that have reached out to specific community groups of colour, the reaction often has come back as, we're quite weary at the moment of being asked suddenly in the last year, being asked for a lot of advice and answers. I think people are glad to be involved, but they need to know that the information is going to be beneficial in the long run. And I think if you can build up a relationship where you're encouraging people to come into the heritage organisation, get a special invite, get a little bit of special treatment somewhere, if it's a, you know, whatever it is that's important to them or they will find helpful or beneficial. I think that's important to do. To also to make sure, I think what sometimes can happen, and it isn't always intentional, it happens sometimes just because of bad habits, or sometimes it's just a lack of forethought or a little bit of laziness. Sometimes the worst case scenario is this: people's perspectives, people's experiences, very specific knowledge is asked for and written down and used by the organisation. Organisation goes away and applies for funding. Let's say it now goes and works with a much bigger organisation. Those people are then totally left out, and that kind of very specific and useful information that they couldn't have got otherwise very easily is now benefiting them, and those people are left out. And people remember and people talk. And I think if you can avoid anything resembling that, then you're on, it's all about building trust and goodwill and long-term relationships in whatever way you can.
Yeah, so you can quite literally ask for help on inclusion and then exclude that person going forwards, and it's
absolutely, yeah,
great. That's so helpful. Now we've got a number of questions in the chat box, so let's go through those. In Lancashire, there was huge support. This is more of a history question, but we'll start with. In Lancashire, there was huge support by the weavers of the blockade of the cotton imports to the UK during cotton famine. They were prepared to starve in support of the slaves in their situation. Was there similar support in Scotland? Just on the history side, Lisa.
Yeah, sure. And the people are very proud of that even now. It's an amazing story. Now, as far as I know, there wasn't anything quite the same in Scotland. Now, Scots fought on both sides of the American Civil War, fought for the North, they fought for the South. You had quite a few of the Confederate leaders ex-Confederate leaders who came to Scotland afterwards because of that kind of kinship. The Scottish connections with the South are very, very strong. They came to Scotland to recover. What from that period, you've got these ships leaving the Clyde, the specially designed, very fast ships leaving the Clyde. You've got 25,000 men employed in the yards at the end of the American Civil War. You've got 3,000 men on the ships. It's creating a huge amount of employment that they really didn't want to give up. And some Scottish historians think that without them funneling arms and food to the Southerners, that the Civil War would have finished quite a bit earlier than it did. So it actually dragged it on by a couple of years. Having said that, you've got a lot of really important and radical Scottish abolitionists, both men and women, and Black abolitionists who were very much welcomed in Scotland as well. And you have a boycott, not so much by the working classes, but you have a boycott by the middle classes who could afford to easily give up things like sugar or cotton, but they're making a political statement in the way that they can. You often had children within these families who are the ones urging the parents not to ever touch slave-produced sugar, and they were very, very strong about that. So you get this kind of like child activist kind of movement in the sort of 1790s, so it's before that period.
It's interesting. It's kind of what we're seeing now with climate change, isn't it?
Yeah,
people say we have to do something about this.
Yeah.
That. Kat, one for you. Could you give some examples of what practical hands-on initiatives look like? Like what sort of activity, and are there any that have worked particularly well? I wonder, maybe particularly with your staff teams, are you running workshops or anything?
So we're doing a number of different things. One of the ones that we're keen to get running this summer are workshops which are going to get people used to just talking about equality, diversity and inclusion issues. I'm kind of spoiled in that I spent like 5 years talking about my identity. So I'm really comfortable talking about the fact that I'm queer, I'm disabled, I'm comfortable about talking about my experiences in those circles. And that's actually quite a good thing for me. But for the most folk, it's like, well, no, they kind of just run away and freeze up or panic. And they're like, oh, well, how do we talk about this? And it's about getting folks a bit more comfortable about talking around different identities. One of the big things that I always have is I hear folks saying to me, I just don't want to get it wrong. I just don't want to upset people. I don't want to frighten anyone, or I don't want to make anyone feel that they're not safe. And it's like, that is really admirable. It's wonderful, but you're human and you're going to mess up sometimes. Like a more useful skill is to like get folk comfortable with using language, get folk to understand how to apologize efficiently, because you're going to have to use that as a skill at some point. We all do. But also encouraging folk to come out of this thing where like you become frightened of making mistakes. That's the key thing, is that you are going to potentially get stuff wrong. You might make assumptions. Guess what? You're human. That's what happens. But the important thing is that you then recognize that and go, what do I do differently? Like, I've done this wrong. I'm really sorry for that. I will now either go away and learn how I can do this differently. You can tell me actually what makes you feel better in this situation. Like, you know, it's about just understanding that that's how you get those skills. And there's other stuff as well, like, you know, you can have sessions on terminology, which is something we're going to run as well. You might do workplace sessions of like raising awareness. So for example, we have quite a number of people who've come up to me to talk about neurodiverse conditions like ADHD, autism, and things like that. But within the wider trust, there doesn't seem to be much of a conversation around that. So we've talked about potentially picking up awareness days that we could work towards doing some kind of activity for that, whether it's an information blog, even just stay in a coffee morning. If you love bacon, make a batch of cookies, make a cake, get people to come to a coffee room, obviously COVID safe and all that, because like, you know, we now live in a pandemic and can't just have a random coffee morning. But if you can do that and get people to come in and like have chats and stuff.
Great, that's some really
I hope that's of some help.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things I was thinking about is, you know, for everybody who's on this event today, you're all going to get the recording after this, and it will be broken down into short presentations. Even something you could do is go and watch it with your colleagues and then have a chat afterwards, have a meeting afterwards, and just discuss it. And I think one of my questions I was going to ask is about people often saying it's a tick box exercise. And it's something that you hear a lot. It's just like, oh, it's just ticking a box, just, you know, making sure that boards are 50-50 across genders, all that sort of thing. And I think my reaction is always, we are so far away from where we need to be, and we're so far away from people being comfortable, that actually we do need to do all these things, and we do need to cover all the bases until we reach the point that everyone's comfortable in every situation and everyone's welcome and they know they are. So until we're there, yeah, we've got to do all of this. Anybody else got any ideas on the kind of practical hands-on initiatives or activities that you can do, say, with community groups or heritage groups?
I think what was really, I had a really great experience with V&A Dundee in 2019. I was invited as part of the transnational history network. So there was a few of us that went up there, and we spent time looking at specific objects in the design exhibit. You know, we walked around the design exhibition, or we're looking at specific objects and looking at the labels, and we're coming up with different ideas about how to bring a new perspective to it. And it was interesting because to really understand that from a curator's perspective, how really hard that is to do when you've got a really limited amount of words to use, is difficult. But also, you know, we changed the labels, we went through a whole process. I think people have responded really well to that. But what then we've done, I was invited to come back and be part of some short films, so we could talk about the process of that, and we could talk about, add a bit more context in it. And so it's not just that label that you're going away with, you've got other ways of accessing the stories and the information as well. But I think that was really helpful and very fruitful. And we really spent a lot of time listening to each other's perspectives on that and trying to fuse them as much as we could.
I think what one of the speakers said earlier about a buddy system, I think it was Lisa.
Yeah.
I think that is such a fantastic idea. In my spare time, I volunteer as an ambassador for a limb difference charity. And they, a couple of months ago, put me together with, you know, as someone that was born with a limb difference, put me together with a brand new mum who got a 2-week-old baby who was born the same as me. And, you know, she basically was feeling very pessimistic, you know, what is my baby going to be able to do? What are they going to not be able to do as they grow up? You know, are they going to be bullied at school? All those sort of questions that goes through most parents' minds, you know, no matter how your child is born. And this buddy system has been absolutely fantastic for both of us. You know, it's made me learn some new things about myself that I didn't realise before. So I think even with smaller organisations, if you can maybe buddy a volunteer up with somebody from, you know, the community that you're trying to engage with, or another employee that you think, you know, has one of the characteristics that you're talking about, I think it can only be a good thing.
Great. That also makes me think of the reverse mentoring. So
Yeah.
You don't always have to pair someone with someone who's higher up and older. You can pair them with someone, you can also pair them with someone who is younger with a different perspective there and a different viewpoint, and actually everyone can learn from each other. Also thinking about activities and inclusion, it makes me think of museums and heritage sites where you can have autism friendly, you know, mornings and hours, and create a space where people with different learning difficulties and disabilities can come and be far more relaxed. I know cinemas do screenings and things, and actually why not do that in your building, in your site, and just make everyone feel comfortable. So Lisa, we've got one here for you. Any tips on dealing with institutions which are implicated in slavery and colonialism issues? How can they kind of...
I think I would need to know what those issues are, because that's really broad.
Really broad.
Yeah, good question, but if I could narrow it down a wee bit, I could answer it more easily.
Okie doke. Perhaps the person who asked that question could send a bit of a follow-up to that, or if they're happy to ask the question live. I imagine it's connecting to one of the older institutions that we have that goes way back and just not sure how to tackle things. Oh, I've got a hand up. Let's see. Let's allow to talk. There we are. Edinburgh World Heritage.
Yeah, it's me, Lisa. It's Nick. Just thinking about schools, for example, that part of their endowment has come from proceeds of slavery. Other institutions that are very sensitive about how they might be perceived by residents and partners. Any tips on how to approach that type of institution?
So an institution that know that they got their original funding from, let's say, enslavers or people involved in colonial activity,
or where research has revealed that to be the case. Yes.
Sure. I think it's very important to be upfront about it, because people are going to probably find out anyway, unless it's all been completely buried. I think for school, for example, I was asked to work with James Gillespie's high school on this, and one of my suggestions to them, and this is having worked with teachers and gone into the schools, we've done all sorts of work with them, different forms, I was suggesting that we get the young people themselves to get involved in the research, they're invested in it, and get them to decide about what they want to do with that information. I mean, it's obviously working with teachers and parents, and, you know, alumni have a certain amount of potentially say in it. But I think the fact that the power is coming from the young people themselves, and to decide then how they want to then recontextualize Gillespie, for example. There were some young people talking about wanting to change the name, and I said, well, if you want to keep the link to the history, you could perhaps find the name of a person who was enslaved on a tobacco plantation that was creating the tobacco that ended up in the Gillespie's tobacco shop and snuff shop on the Royal Mile. So you keep that link, but you are honouring the person who actually allowed the wealth and allowed that school to happen, rather than the person who was doing the exploitation. So I think there are many ways of approaching it, but I think the more honest and open people are, the better. If you're having a Founders Day, that should be part of the story as well, and shouldn't be left out.
Brilliant, thank you for that. That made me think of a presentation that we had at our Addressing Racism event, which was last August, which was Bearse Community Trust, which is just kind of northeast of the Cairngorms, which is a very a rural Scottish community, and actually they know that the wealth that built the community, so it built the school, it built the village hall, it built a lot of the buildings, a lot of that came from overseas slavery. And they were really conscious that as a rural Scottish community, there are very few people from marginalised backgrounds who were physically there to engage with them. You know, it's that go and engage with different people. There aren't that many different people about how can we address this, and how can we open this up and educate everybody within our area. They ran a really fantastic research project and created a publication, but they connected with schools in the Caribbean, I believe, who were, you know, from the communities where that wealth was exploited and where it came from, and really raise that awareness so that everybody in the community are aware of it and were part of this project. And all the young people, all the children in that school, therefore have that full awareness, and wherever they kind of go in the future, they're taking that with them. So I'm just going to post in the chat box the link to that presentation. What I'll do, it's a YouTube video that you can watch. When I send out the videos and recordings from our event today, I'll send the link to all the recordings from our Addressing Racism event, and you can have a look at those as well, because there's some really great case studies. So lovely. Nick, I don't know if you wanted to say any more on that, or whether you're happy with that. I might switch off your ability to talk. Thank you very much. So let's go for a question for Kat here. It says, I'm working with an organisation to engage with volunteers for the first time. Do you have any top tips for ensuring inclusive volunteer recruitment? So I wonder quite often whether that particularly relates to maybe the advertising and the sign up and how you really reach people in an inclusive way.
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't know if the person who posted that question would be happy to, but could you maybe drop a couple of bit of extra info in it? Like if it's folk who you're trying to reach out, for example, like folks who've never volunteered before, if you're just looking to widen the demographics of people who volunteer, and things like that, that could be quite helpful. I think generally for recruitment purposes, it's about, we fall into traps, especially as organizations, around recruitment into like bad habits. So it's like, we might post, for example, all of our recruitment on one particular website, or we might use an external third-party website, like MyScotGov, for example, that we use all the time. But then we don't stop and think about actually who are the people most likely to use those sites for recruitment, who are the people who are most likely to see this particular like volunteer opportunity. I think a really good example of this is my role was posted on LinkedIn. Folks who use LinkedIn are more likely to be white, cis, middle-aged, and tend to sort of like only use it purely for like sort of networking purposes or like going on for jobs. I have a friend who works in theatre and arts, where they had always been posting their things in particular arts magazines and stuff like that for their positions. And she'd said, well, how about we try and actually put it out like on different social media accounts? They were like, well, why would we do that? Because it's an official opportunity. And she went, yeah, but if you're a young person, you're not going to sit on like an arts website for ages looking for volunteer opportunities. You want something quick, you want something fast. And that's why social media works better for them if we want to get younger people in, and particularly folks who would use social media in different ways and are a bit more creative like that. And it's the same kind of thing I think that we need to apply when we're looking at like if you're recruiting either employees or volunteers, think about where you're recruiting, think about the types of people who would probably see that, and if you could change that around. I think as well, making sure that if you're building up relationships with folks, Lisa said earlier about it being about authentic relationships, that's a key thing. If you build authentic relationships with other groups outside of just asking them to come in and volunteer for you, they are more likely to reciprocate that by sharing that volunteer opportunity with their networks. Again, it's just about that whole thing of actually treating people as a whole entirety, not just as one thing or one product you can get out of them, and actually thinking about how you can support them and then in turn how they will mutually support you and do that sort of stuff. I hope that that helps. Also, thank you for clarifying about widening the demographic. I'm glad I went with that as a potential and just answered that.
Brilliant. I think that's really helpful. We find we've been working quite closely with the West of Scotland Regional Equality Council, and they are fantastic at sharing opportunities, particularly from the heritage sector and museum sector, with all of their contacts. And that's just it's just another example that actually there are these organisations out there who are connecting with people who maybe you aren't connecting with already. They will happily share your opportunities. Bev, I didn't know whether you might have anything kind of from your view about what might encourage people, or what might help people maybe with limb difference or who are disabled to engage with volunteering opportunities. you might best be kind of reached?
I think one of the easiest things to do is, in any imagery that you use, make sure you're using, images of the people that you want to attract. And that's not just, using an image of a person in a wheelchair. It goes much further than that. We want people of all shapes and sizes, all ages, all colours, all sorts of backgrounds, just to really put that little bit of extra thought and extra work into it, really. That would be my first tip.
Great. And I think, as Lisa was saying earlier, read things from a different perspective. I find I listen to podcasts a lot. Bev, do you want to make your little announcement for today about your podcast?
Oh, wow. Yes, today my podcast with Stacey Dooley has landed on the BBC Sounds app. That's available now if anybody wants to have a listen. It's called Stacey Dooley Fresh Starts, and it's all about my journey to becoming bionic.
Fab. And that's the thing, is that there is information out there that you can go and have a listen to, and you can go and find out and understand what someone else's experiences might be. Lisa said that the Melville mission was the largest ever to leave these shores. There's another history question for you, Lisa. Was it bigger than the D-Day invasion force, even its British element?
What I could tell you, it wasn't just Melville alone. He was working with Prime Minister Pitt, his good buddy. And we're looking at about 40,000 deaths of British men alone in that mission. And this is a period from 1793 to 1798. And quite a lot of the deaths happen because of yellow fever, not just from fighting as well. But if someone's got the figures at their fingertips for D-Day, we can make a comparison. But yeah, huge military mission that went on for several years and left out of Portsmouth, generally in England.
Great, thank you for that. That's the kind of questions from the attendees answered. So if you've got any more, do add them into the Q&A box. One thing that I was going to ask the speakers is just if there's one thing that you would like people to either take away and think about, or one thing that you'd like them to go away and do to help kind of increase equality across their organisation, what would your kind of suggestion to be? Just to give you that to think about. Go on, Bev.
Shall I go first? I think the one thing I would like people to really get ingrained into their heads is that ED&I, it's a little bit like what I would say about accessibility as well. It's not just a tick box exercise, as was said earlier. This sort of work improves the lives and experiences of everyone, not just the people that you might have in mind, it's everybody. And as with accessibility, if you make a place or things online more accessible, you're making them accessible for everyone. So it's exactly the same with ED&I. People's circumstances change over time, over years. You might be in a position now where it doesn't really apply to you, you feel, but it could do in the future. So that would be my one thing.
Lovely, thanks, Bev. Kat, do you have any one thing for people to take away?
I would say, in a similar vein to what Bev has just said, ED&I is fundamentally about the humanity of people. It's about ensuring that everybody is able to live with dignity and respect as a fundamental piece, whether it's like in their workforce or in their wider society. And actually, if you are guided by that principle of ensuring that everybody who you are working with has dignity and respect, that will be a fundamental guiding principle for you as you run on this marathon.
Lovely, thank you. That ties in. I know Emma Griffiths has put into the chat box about basic human decency, and that's kind of what's running through for everyone. Lisa.
Oh, I'm going to squeeze 3 little things in one. They are connected, I promise you. It's really important that you protect people. So when they come in, you want to attract them, but then you want to make sure and keep retention. So you make sure that you're protecting people from any, for example, let's say, racial slurs or racist language or frosty kind of welcome or that kind of thing. So you make sure that you have prepared your existing volunteer base and workforce to make sure that that doesn't happen. I think extending your social circle, that actually going out into community events and, you know, making that extra time to go and find out about what's happening in the community so that you can link to a festival. And that can be a very easy way of bringing in new kinds of people and communities to your organisation, to link it to specific festivals that are happening throughout the year and how that could be reflected within your organisation.
Lovely. That's some really good points to think about. Did anybody come to say anything that they haven't yet had an opportunity to say before we kind of bring things to a close? Bev, I see you.
Yeah, go on. I thought I might as well jump in and say that in September, the Heritage Trust Network is organising an LGBTQ event all about how to break down the barriers, work with the LGBT community, and as we mentioned earlier about terminology, you know, how to not be frightened to talk to that community and the terminology you can use. So that will be going up on our website very shortly if you want to check that out.
Brilliant. Lovely. I think that's us. We will draw to a close then. Thank you very much to Lisa and to Kat for those fantastic presentations. I think those will stay with HTN for a long time because they're going to be so helpful. We'll be sharing those on our member platform, and the Make Your Mark campaign will be sharing those as well in due course, but they'll just be sent to the attendees for now. So I'm just going to share my screen again. Thank you very much. And we'll also, when we contact people, we'll make sure that we point them to your websites and your contact information so they can reach you. Thank you very much. Lovely. So I'm just going to share my screen one last time. She says. There we go. So thank you everyone very much for joining us. Thank you to our funders at the Architectural Heritage Fund, the National Trust for Scotland and the National Lottery Heritage Fund, as well as the Make Your Mark campaign. Lovely to be able to host this event for them and with them. There will of course be a survey that we're sending to you, and it's going to ask you lots of questions. So that is of course for our funders and to help us to make sure that we're reaching people that we want to reach. And to hear from you, give us all your feedback. That's what it's for. We're really interested to know what you thought. And yes, as I say again, you will receive all the recordings. The recordings will have full subtitles. My apologies for that. Talking about accessibility, and we've failed on that one today, so we'll make sure we get it right in the future. Do look us up on heritagetrustnetwork.org.uk, and we'd love to see you at an event soon. So bye for now.